welcome back, and got some new faces in the room. Welcome. Having a great conversation today, and looking forward to hearing from our next panelists. And so I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panel. So I'm going to start with Tara Mitchell. And Tara also, I had to take my beadwork and put it on her table because Tara made the beadwork that I had. So somebody don't let me forget. Like I already paid for that. So, but Tara Mitchell is a member of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation and has worked as the Deputy Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the last 2.5 years. She graduated from Haskell Indian Nations University in 2013 with her BA in Indigenous and American Indian Studies, and she specializes in tribal history and community outreach. She's an accomplished beadwork artist and enjoys spending time with her husband and 3 children. And Rafe told me to say she is the most Potawatomi person ever, and so we are royalty. And we also have Kara Heights, and Kara is a historian and educator who engages in cultural history storytelling through a variety of formats. She has taught in higher education for 14 years and is currently lecturer in the Liberal Arts Department of the Kansas City Art Institute, where she teaches courses in American history, film and history, and critical studies. She also runs a media production company, Cleo's Scroll Productions. Did I say that right? All right, Scroll Productions, that creates historically focused documentary films, podcasts, and digital exhibits, including the multi-award-winning podcast Kansas 1972 and the award-winning documentary film A New Deal for Public Art in the Free State. Got some awards, all right. Heights consults with museums, libraries, schools, and other institutions about regional art in their collections and is developing a comprehensive catalog of all New Deal federally funded art projects in Kansas. All right, and this one right here, you talk about being the most Potawatomi. This is council member Raphael Wawasuk, and if you hear the Wawasuk name, there's a lot of Wawasuks out there. So I don't know if you'll have to figure out who you're talking to figure out if you want to see if they're connected to him. They may say yes, they may say no, but Councilman Wawasuk is a member, tribal council, and tribal councilman of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation. He is a distinguished tribal council member and stands at the intersection of leadership, education, and community service. His commitment to excellence and profound impact on tribal government make him a compelling speaker for our event. Mr. Wawasuk's journey is marked by a commitment to service and dedication to fostering positive change within his community. Armed with a background in organizational management and leadership, he exemplifies a spirit of continuous learning. His recent completion of the Harvard Business School Tribal Leadership Executive Education Program, dang, Harvard, further solidifies his expertise in effective strategies and decision making. With a wealth of experience in tribal judicial systems, Mr. Wawasuk brings invaluable insights to our gathering. His astute management skills and strategic vision has played a pivotal role in the advancement and prosperity of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, reflecting a profound understanding of tribal governments. And we're going to keep going here. Beyond his professional pursuits, Mr. Wawasuk's philanthropic endeavors are noteworthy. Volunteering for the Boys and Girls Club and public schools, he embodies the principle of giving back to the community, and his selfless dedication to nurturing and guiding the next generation underscores his belief in the transformative power of education and mentorship. In conclusion, it is an honor to present Mr. Wawasuk as a distinguished leader on this panel, and he's a catalyst for positive change, and his presence today gives us a unique opportunity to learn from his experiences and work collaboratively towards building a brighter future together. So that's a good one, man. But I'm kidding with him, but in all reality, in all seriousness, I've been able to work with him on our Kansas Advisory Council for Indigenous Education, and we've done a lot of collaborative work together in the past couple of years, really. And so it's a great honor to have these folks today, and we're looking for a great conversation. And I'll just turn it over to you. We decided to do all 3 at the beginning so they can kind of bounce around. So it's not they're not restricted to only talking one at a time. And so I'm getting out of the way.
I'll just start out really quick by introducing this piece that's in the exhibition that sort of started this whole journey of me having the opportunity to meet you guys and exchange information and figure out, this program and reconnect you with the beadwork. So I'll just introduce what's in the exhibition, then I'll let you guys talk about the history of the Prairie Band Potawatomi and beadwork and family connections. And then I'll end talking about the WPA program that created it. But so this particular, this image and this bag are in the To the Stars Through Art exhibition. And so what we'll be talking about today is sort of the story of this program, this piece, but I think more importantly, the larger story of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation and the place of this beadwork within, within your history, past and present. So, but this particular bag, you can go see yourself. It was created by a WPA program in Kansas on a WPA workshop in Mayetta. And then this is a picture from the Kansas State Historical Society showing members of the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, artists from Prairie Band Potawatomi working on beadwork items for this program. So I'm going to hand it over to Tara and Raphael, and you guys can tell me what slides to do, and you can talk about sort of the first part of the presentation.
Bonjour. I want to just say that I did reach out to tribal members and elders to try to identify some of these individuals in this picture, and funny, the only person they can identify is the person with the back towards us, and that is Josie McKinney, and no one knew who the rest of them were, so at least we know what the back of Josie McKinney looks like. So we're going to go ahead and go to the slide. It is the map. This one. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our councilman here to talk about our history from the beginning.
All right, thank you, Tara. So as was mentioned earlier today, obviously Potawatomi, we're not local here either, right? We were transplanted here in 1800s, 1847-ish is kind of when we started to make our appearance here in Kansas, what we call Kansas today. But there's a brief kind of summary of some of our migrations. And so, yeah, in our history, we have origins going back to the East Coast prior to our relocation to the Great Lakes area, prior to our forced removals from that area into what we call Kansas today. And presently, there's a few bands of us located throughout the United States and Canada. Is that on the? Okay, yeah, so one of the things that I'd like to speak to highlight a little bit is last year at the Potawatomi gathering, at the annual gathering of all the Potawatomi nations, the leadership decided to adopt confederacy amongst all of our Potawatomi bands again. And so to me, that's really exciting because, you know, here we are a couple hundred years removed from our residences and our relationships with the other bands, and we're still here today, right? We aren't supposed to be here, as was represented by the presentations that we heard earlier this afternoon. The whole intent was to do away with us because we were a problem. But to me, this action that we took last year in Michigan is really impactful and meaningful, and it gives me hope that we can strengthen, you know, our connections again, not only just familial connections or community connections, but also economic strengthening, political strengthening, and then hopefully in some of the other work that I'm involved in, this can kind of help grow and sustain some of that. You know, as Alex mentioned, you know, we've worked together here in Kansas on some educational items, but that work is also happening across the country for other tribes and tribal educators. And so, again, you know, I think we're moving in the right direction here, taking some of the steps necessary to really reclaim our sovereignty in so many different aspects, you know, educational, intellectual, you know, geographical, because one of the things for our confederacy here is, you know, we historically have occupied those spaces around the lakes, which includes what is now known as Canada, and that imaginary boundary line that they put in place that has stifled some of our trade and some of our interactions with our relatives up there. And so, again, I just wanted to speak to this a little bit and highlight that. Again, it's exciting for me. I'm interested to see how far we can go with it. So thank you for letting me divert a little bit away from the main focus of the group here today and talk about that a little bit. So I guess I'll kind of circle back here and talk about in the 1840s. Let's see, I always struggle with this. What year did Kansas become a state? 1860 somewhere? Somewhere, one? Okay, all right. So 1861, right? Kansas is now a state. So, and this is a little quiz material that I like to throw out here also is, who can tell me one of the prerequisites to going from a territory to a state? There was one specific prerequisite that you had to prove to the United States government before you could be considered for statehood. Okay, it is related to population. Okay, anybody? No? All right. So you had to prove that within your territory there was less Indians than there were non. Okay, so again, when we talk about removals and what that meant, and then statehood and what that meant, again, it's all genocidal practices. And that's my words, is the genocidal practices. So Kansas, right, had to push out everybody who was already here. Well, for Prairie Band, when we came in, we were done. Like, it was like, no, we've already entered into these treaties with you. We have over 40, which is, to my knowledge, the most out of any other tribal nation. And so we're good. We've sold off or agreed to these transactions for millions of acres that we occupied historically. Even in Council Bluffs, we had thousands and thousands of acres of area that we occupied in that area in Iowa before we got to Kansas. And so, in the 1800s in Kansas, we're good. So when we came in, we originally purchased a 30 by 30 square mile reservation, which extended from the northeast corner of the intersection there in what is now Jackson County, Andrew Jackson County, by the way. And it extended 30 miles south into what is now Topeka, and then it came west all the way over just east of Wamego. And so that was the land base that we purchased from the Caw sessions in the 1800s. And so for the Prairie Band, because we were kind of at a point where we didn't want to negotiate anymore, they kind of corralled us up into a little area, a little northeast corner of that land base to a 11 by 11 section, which we call our common lands, because we wanted to keep everything in common. We did not want to accept allotment. We did not want to accept citizenship. What are we at, the 100-year anniversary of that act too, right? The 1924 Citizenship Act, coming up here in June, if I'm not mistaken. But that stuff wasn't for us, because again, the 30 by 30, and this was 1800s, which seems like a long time ago, but there were pretty current happenings taking place not too far in front of WPA and some of the things with Haskell and Carlisle. And I have connections to both. Actually, Jim Thorpe is a relative of mine through his Potawatomi mother. And so there's a connection there. And I didn't personally attend Haskell, but I did go to Haskell on the weekends. So there's a tie-in there. So I don't know, Terry, you want to pick it up a little bit here?
Yeah, we were going to go ahead and talk about the WPA program that was took place on the reservation in the 1930s, and she's going to show a list of names. So these are all the band members here that took part in the WPA program. So these were like beaters. We made bow and arrows and silver. I mean, they had a lot of skills, these people. And actually, Rosanna B. Potts, Keokomakwa, that is my great-great-grandma. And my grandma is here, and that is her grandma. Yeah, this is her, so this is Keokomakwa. And she was a very, very good bead artist, which is interesting because nobody has done beadwork after her until me and my mom. And so it was kind of taken away, I assume, boarding school, all the things that happened to our people. I was asking my grandma, why didn't you bead? And she said, well, we didn't have money to buy the supplies. We were in survival mode during that time. No one could teach us because they were too busy trying to survive, in the 30s, which is why I believe a lot of these, they took this job because it was to provide for their family. And so, yeah, we can go ahead and show the next. And this is actually Rayfield's relative, so if you want to say something about.
So yeah, Henry Nagambi, that's one of my uncles there. And then, so not the lady directly next to him, but the one kind of in the middle. That's my great-grandmother, Josette. And then that's, their mother off to the side there. And so when we were talking about these art programs going on in these institutes and institutions, we got to realize that the creation of the art or the crafts or anything for profit, this was a practice that our people engaged in, years and years before we were ever, going to be civilized, if you will. Part of the work that Tara and I are involved in is, we have to do consultations with museums or universities or other institutions that may have some artifacts in their collections. And one of the tougher parts of that job is to try to determine if an object was original, I guess, if you will, right? Because it was known back in the day that these collectors would come through and they would pay money for these items. So a lot of times folks were just crafting something up because they knew a collector was coming in and that they would buy it from them. And it's the same thing, right? It's a source of revenue for the individual at the time. And so, that's one of the things that we have to balance in our work presently is, what was the purpose of it, and can we really look and determine it? It's tough. Some of this stuff is hundreds of years old, and so it really is tough. But again, to my uncle, by this time here in the 30s, he had already, been in the war once. He was in World War II, and then he was in Korea again after that, and so again, in the 30s, in the WPA era, I mean, what's happening here in Kansas, right? It's Great Depression, it's Dust Bowl time, and we're still at a point in time where we kind of have to have permission to even leave the res. We're still got to ask the Indian agent, hey man, we're thinking about going to town to go shopping for groceries. Is that all right? And that's crazy to me because today, we just kind of get up and go, and it's not that big of a deal. I joke with people when they come and visit us. I'm like, where's your passport? And they kind of look at me like, what do you mean? I say, no, man, we're in a sovereign nation, sovereign territory. Where's that passport at? I got a stamp right here. And, so then I had one person, they start reaching. I was like, dang, you got one? But yeah, it was reversed, right? It was reversed. We had to, ask our Indian agents, is it all right for us to leave? And so, again, even though my uncle here, he passed in '84, I was a small child, so I didn't really have a chance to, at least that I remember, interact with him very much. So I couldn't, really say what their thinking was of being involved in the project at the time. But I would imagine from the stories that I'm familiar with, that it was, a way to provide income for the family, to just survive, to get your basic goods that you needed.
I did want to mention my great-great-grandma Keokomokwa. I had an uncle share a story about her. I don't know where she was. She was in either Mayetta or somewhere. She was working on a pair of moccasins for herself, and I assume she didn't bead for herself, because as beaders we don't really bead for ourselves, we bead for other people. So this was her first pair of moccasins that she was going to make for herself, and a man came through, a white man, and he said, how much for the moccasins? She goes, these aren't for sale. And she went somewhere, and when she came back, they were gone. He had stolen them, and they are in display at Denver Museum somewhere. So that is, I know the World Fairs were going on around this time, which the reason there's an increase in, interest in Native art. The World Fairs were, I think the Chicago one was in the 1930s, around this time. So I don't know if that had anything to do with getting this Native art out there, if it was going to eventually be, sold at one of the fairs. I'm not sure, but I imagine, like you said, there was a lot of make these things for money going on at this time. So I just wanted to share that quick story of the research I've been doing for this project, and the stories that I've been hearing from the elders. A lot of that did happen to our people, a lot of stolen items. So.
And I was going to say, I can't just at any point I can stop, and I can talk for a very long time. So, but one issue I do want to circle back around to, because I think this is really important in this discussion we've had, is for today, where should these pieces be? Who should have them? Where should they be displayed? Where should they not be displayed? Who has ownership, who has rights over them. And, often we think of, oh, well, somebody was paid a wage for producing that, or somebody sold it, so therefore it's clear, but it isn't so clear, right? If people are living under conditions where they have no other choice but to take this particular job, then what is it, especially, primarily white institutions that have these pieces, what is our obligation today to recognize that history? And I think, that's a big conversation now. We're all talking about that with, the new revisions to NAGPRA, and those are really important conversations. I thought I would tell you a bit about the history of the program itself, but at any point we can stop and talk. So I'm not in any way, I'm not Native, right? I'm a non-Indigenous historian, and I specialize in the 1930s and the Works Progress Administration, and especially arts programs. So this was a new area for me, and I am learning lots and lots from my Native colleagues. So, and the one program that I was looking at is something, WPA program that existed in about 20 states, called the Museum Extension Project. And it technically was not an arts project, but it was a project that was aimed at creating visual aids for education. And I want to give you a couple examples of some of the stuff. For example, the Kansas WPA Museum Project created a series of prints of essentially European-style costumes. You could get wooden models of things like stagecoaches and different other implements of transportation. You could get prints of a series of Kansas birds. You could get various dioramas of Kansas history, of dinosaurs, you'll actually see part of the exhibition is dioramas of various Native American groups that were in Kansas prior to European contact. You get historic costume dolls. So it's, and of course from a very Eurocentric perspective, but it was all aimed at providing visual educational tools, primarily for schools, but also for libraries and museums. And so part of what I've been doing is tracking down where all of these objects are today. And the Kansas Museum Project produced a catalog that was sent to schools and libraries and museums with an order form. And you could look at all of the different objects, prints and dioramas and all these different things, and order what you wanted for your institution and pay a very nominal fee. And this page really struck me when I came across it for a variety of reasons. So as you can see, this is an image from the 1940 Museum Extension Project catalog. It is an image of various objects of beadwork as well as weaving and embroidery, clay, metalwork, and woodwork, and quote, are made by Indians exemplifying their racial handicrafts, which obviously is of the time and incredibly problematic. But I want to know who made this? What were the conditions under which they made these objects? I want to, who are the artists behind this? What's their story? And I wanted to know their names, their histories, and find out, can I find this now? And sort of reconnect, because there's clearly a specific story here. Right, the particular sort of cultural affiliation is totally erased. You have this sort of pan-Indian trope, which was very common at the time, obviously, still common today. But I want to know what the specific story is. So I did a lot of research and contacted Tara and Raphael and went to the National Archives and found out specifically about this Kansas WPA program. Actually, you know what, I was gonna give you the context first, but let me kind of give you the specifics. I don't know. I'll give you the context first, really quick. Okay, so we have been talking a bit, and I think Travis talked a little bit about the Indian New Deal. The question is, so why in the world is the US federal government in the 1930s establishing this program? Why did they set up a workshop in Mayetta? Why did they include beadwork that we now know was created by Prairie Bend Potawatomi artisans? Why did they want to send them to schools that were primarily for white children? What's going on? Why is this happening? And then also, I think to end, what do we do with this today? What's the importance today? So, of course, you have the New Deal. Hold on. My slides are all over. So I don't know if I have to tell you guys what the New Deal is, right? You have the Great Depression, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt essentially establishes these significant series of government programs, including the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, to provide relief, to provide recovery, and also to reform. And a lot of this included jobs, right? The WPA is a jobs program, and they're doing things like digging ditches and planting trees and building roads and building dams, like public works, that's what we think about. But it also included all of these other programs, arts programs, the museum program. Part of the New Deal is also what we call the Indian New Deal. And Travis covered this, so I won't go into a lot of detail. But it is a pretty significant shift in US federal government policy towards indigenous communities in the US. Although I was thinking about how to actually phrase this, and I was reminded, I'm gonna paraphrase this terribly. I was reminded of a joke that the Black comedian Chris Rock made about the idea of Black progress. And he said, it hasn't, over the history of the United States, it's not that there's been Black progress, it's actually been white progress. White people have just been progressively less terrible, right? So we talk about the Indian New Deal, yeah, sure, I mean, it's better, right? It's a significant step in white people being less terrible, pretty much. But it, sort of rejecting allotment policies, some restoration of stolen land. This is where you get, contemporary tribal governments get established at that point. Their tribes are allowed to incorporate businesses. There's a lot of educational opportunities, although there's still a lot of criticism, right, that it's still assimilationist, it's still paternalistic, but it's a significant shift. And Native Americans actually participated quite significantly in New Deal programs. The Mayetta WPA workshop was not unusual, right? The WPA and other New Deal programs had a lot of presence and a lot of programs in Native American nations. So left is the Civilian Conservation Corps workers building a diversion in Tuba City, Arizona. And then right is members of the Blackfoot tribe meeting with John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs and, for the time, a definite reformist, to somebody who recognized from sort of his white perspective the value and importance of indigenous cultures and wanting to promote them and preserve them and not eradicate them, right? So less terrible, right? He's less terrible. So that's taking place within the context of the New Deal, and the New Deal working with Native American communities. Alex, you had a story? Didn't you have a family member who worked for the New Deal program? Or yeah. Mayetta, which is, I believe, is adjacent to the Potawatomi. It doesn't sit on Potawatomi. Is Mayetta in Potawatomi territory, or it's right? Yeah. So the Indian agent in Mayetta, this is information that I found in 1937, that a WPA administrator had been, in Mayetta talking about WPA programs. So it isn't just this beadwork program, there's other programs going on. And this is from a publication. I love the name of this publication because it emphasizes this theme that we've been talking about, right? This is a Interior Department publication that ran from 1933 to 1945 called Indians at Work, right? Because can you believe it? Indians were getting them to work, right? It says a lot. But it documents a lot of the New Deal programs. And so this was an important piece of information. And this is talking about WPA projects in Mayetta with the Prairie Band Potawatomi. So you can see at the end, we have Indian leaders assigned by the WPA for various educational, recreational, gardening, canning, museum, office records, sewing, and other projects. They've been beneficial to our Indian group in a variety of ways, in addition to providing sources of income for Indians who would otherwise be unemployed. So again, right, it's this emphasis on creating jobs and marketable skills. So this is what was happening. This is really the most significant piece of information from the Bureau of Indian Affairs records I've found about this particular program. And it was in the BIA records where I started actually finding the names of people and actually being able to identify some of these artists. So this is documenting an individual who is Prairie Band Potawatomi, Henry McKinney, and he was the individual who was running the Mayetta WPA workshop. And he's directing beadworkers, silverwork, making bows and arrows, dolls and cradle boards, lacrosse sticks, and we can show some images of, at the end, the KU Spencer Museum of Art actually has a lot of these objects, for now. That's all I'm gonna say. And then they were sent to schools. And this is the only image that I have of I think this is in the exhibition. So this is an image that I found at the Topeka Public Library local history room in a box labeled WPA stuff. And, I think this also really connects a lot to what Travis was talking about in terms of Haskell students who were given jobs or internships at this time period to go to summer camps with white students, right? There is kind of this element of educating white students about indigenous cultures, but is that really what's going on? And what is really the purpose of having incredible beadwork with absolutely stripped of all cultural context to white school children? Is this sort of deep learning, or is this playing Indian? And I think that's kind of the kinds of questions we need to be thinking about. I'm almost positive, I'm not 100% sure, I'm almost positive that this image is from the Topeka Public Schools Visual Education Library. They had a specific institution.
So, Carrie, if I can just interject one thing real quick. So, if you look at the date here, that's 1942. And so again, just to put this into context for everybody, as we are progressing, right, the Indians now have skills. Now they can do things, they can contribute. In the meanwhile, these art type programs are going on at the same time, which, to your point, doesn't provide any context to the what and the why. So they are, in a sense, dehumanizing us as a people, right? And making us these caricatures. So if you think about some of the Westerns at the time, right? And then Lone Ranger and Tonto and them. So even for the promotion of this progress that is happening, you got to think 1942, well, that's 10 years right before there's over 100 tribes on a list by the U.S. Congress for termination. Okay, so they're still working on getting rid of the Indian problem. It's just in different ways. And, to me, this always sticks out. This photo here especially, because these kids here, it's all right for them to grab these items, put them on, walk around in them, take their picture or whatever. But at the same time, if those things have religious importance to our people, it's unacceptable for us to wear them because we didn't get freedom of religion, right, according to the United States government until the 70s. So again, I just want to put a couple things in context for everybody there.
We're looking at the various ways that indigenous cultures sort of get appropriated and used, right? And so, on the one hand, we can kind of criticize this pan-Indian trope. These are both from the exhibition. These are both also objects produced by this museum extension project, right? So I think it's easy to sort of criticize this sort of stripped of all cultural context. This is what the Indian is like, the bad guy in Westerns, that is easy. But what we also see at this time, and I think you're seeing it with the increasing teaching of Indigenous arts and crafts in boarding schools, you're seeing it with the dioramas that are in this exhibition, there is this increasing interest in white culture in more specific information about Native culture. But it's kind of either in this, I'll talk about this in a minute, in this, like we want to commodify the art, the aesthetics, or there's also sort of this movement in anthropology and ethnography at the time, which is called salvage ethnography. That's what we call it today. This idea that these cultures are disappearing. Of course, there's never a explanation as to why they could be disappearing, right? Because you made them disappear. These cultures are disappearing and we have to document them. It's this sort of, this objective, like we must document this before it expires. We must, put it in a museum and put a frame around it and say, this is what it is, A, B, C, D. So again, it's less terrible, but it's still sort of the colonizer's view, right? It's still the colonizer's view. And I think an interesting part of this, Tara, did you want to talk about this picture? I know we talked some about it over email. I don't know if you...
Yes. Yeah. So this is kind of the style of dress that our women wear and wore throughout time. I mean, it's not color, but I do have a small ones on the table. If you were to see one in real life in color, that's what that would look like on her. And I did want to say that, they tend to put us in the past, like we're gone, and we've been gone, and that we're not like a living culture to this day. And that's what I kind of noticed working with these institutions and museums, is like they don't acknowledge that tribes are here and they've been here and they're thriving now, and our culture and our crafts and skills, they've always thrived. Not all the time due to, not having, access to the tools or anything we need. But yeah, like I wanted to talk about the women. We wear certain different styles of dresses. So this is called an applique skirt that the lady in the front is wearing. I can't remember her name. I should know this. Is it up there? Oh, Mrs. Frank Mazas? I don't know. I don't recognize that name. But you could see the panel, very intricate. And they noticed they used a lot of conchos and silver on, back in the day, you can see like really beautiful silver work on their outfits. I believe those are her daughters. And like the headband, I have a headband that I made over here also on display. I think that's a satchkin on top. It's kind of like an extra piece on top that our women wear. And I think we talked about this one time. The purpose of that is, I think it could be used as a hood if it's windy, or if a mother was breastfeeding her baby, she could cover up that way. It had, everything had a meaning, and there was purpose for everything that we make, which is kind of sad that it wasn't shared in the schools when these, items were on display. They were just putting them on like, ooh, fun, costumes, and I don't think a lot of our people were very, fluent on English yet back then, right? Like we were still speaking Potawatomi, so if they were to go look at the description, I don't think they would even know, like this is not okay. I mean, I don't think they would care. I mean, the people who wrote it probably wouldn't, care, but our people probably would have. So that's another thing I want to kind of talk about is like we weren't speaking English that good back then. I mean, we were still, I remember people speaking Potawatomi when I was little. And so our language is still, it's fading, but I mean, they were still pretty fluent back then. So yeah, that's our, dress. There's different style of dresses that our women wear. But this, when you look at old pictures, this is what you're gonna see is the panel. And we talked about the colors, right? What they mean. I guess it would be like a yin and yang type of thing, like a balance. The colors, if you look up back here, you'll notice the colors are, on each side, it's even, and that kind of represents, the balance in this world, man, woman, things like that. It's just, everything balances out. And so, yeah, I just wanted to talk about the dress, so thank you.
No, thank you, Tara and Raphael. I'm going to kind of juxtaposition it here because I think, having your explanation is going to kind of be a telling juxtaposition to, because I want to say this particular photograph, which is also from the Kansas State Historical Society, it could be a misidentification because we've had some emails back and forth. I know someone's here from the State Historical Society, and we will be emailing somebody there. There's some individuals misidentified in some of these photos. So, but the person who's listed as the creator, Mary Parkman, was the Kansas State WPA administrator for the Women's and Professional Program Division, which is what the museum project fell under. So there's no information here, but I'm speculating. I'm not really sure. This may have been a photo taken in conjunction with that, because this is a very telling letter that I found in the Bureau of Indian Affairs archives, which is basically from a WPA supervisor to the Potawatomi Agency Superintendent. I shall be in Mayette at 11:15 Monday morning to take pictures of the women and their handicrafts. Mrs. Parkman, who's the woman who took that previous photo, suggests that native arts be well in evidence. She told me that you plan to have the women dressed in their native costumes, right? So again, this idea of creating what is the Indian in the white imagination, right? This is what this program, I think, is about. So, do you guys have, I was gonna say a little bit more about like the commodity, native art as a commodity, but do you want to talk any more about the program or? Okay. So I know we need to, but this is something that we kind of touched on a little bit, but I think besides the idea of creating marketable skills, right, and jobs, and Indians at work. I think another context is the idea that there is, and I take this from a historian, and I like this phrase, that there's this idea of native chic among white consumers that goes from the teens, I would say into the 30s, 40s, but into today, right? Now, on I think a more positive side, the Indian New Deal did help create the Indian Arts and Crafts Board in 1934, which evolved later into the institution we were talking about earlier. And it is today an institution that actively promotes indigenous arts and crafts and indigenous artists and ensures the fact that when an artist says, I am Native, they are indeed Native, right? And so it's a very important board. And this actually goes back to the 30s, and John Collier, who was the head of federal government Indian affairs at this time, was a big promoter of Native American arts and crafts. But this is also a time when, you know, lots of white people are taking trips down to the Southwest and buying pottery off the side of the road, and now it's in like your local county museum, right? And, you know, also what we were talking about, you know, the objects that were taken from students at Haskell, you know, where do they end up, you know, in somebody's little cabinet of curiosities that, you know, and people having Navajo rug designs in their homes, sometimes made by indigenous artists, sometimes not, a lot of times not. So that's the Indian Arts and Crafts Board logo. So this is a time where there is a lot of interest that ranges from the positive to the very negative in terms of Native arts and crafts among sort of white Americans. And a really important part of this is the time too when Native American art sort of becomes seen as authentic in terms of the art community. So in 1941, there was a big exhibit at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Indian Arts of the United States, and I'm gonna not say his name correctly, so art historians help me. René de Harncourt, who was the curator at MoMA at the time. He later would be the director. He directed the Indian Arts and Crafts Board in the 30s. He's the one that creates this exhibit. And Terry, you talked about World's Fair. So I have some evidence that the Prairie Band Potawatomi beadwork was very much something that caught the attention of the Indian Arts and Crafts Board and other individuals in the US federal government. So I don't have exact evidence yet, but it is possible that some of these objects were displayed in these larger national exhibitions. We just don't know yet. So this is a letter, the Indian Arts and Crafts Board, the Oklahoma Field Office, contacting the Potawatomi Indian Agency, essentially saying, these pieces are wonderful. It's a little bit of a paternal, I didn't think they'd be so good, but they're really good, right? And she wants to acquire some of these objects for the Indian Arts and Crafts Board collection. And this is the letter that from the archives, we know what was sent to the Indian Arts and Crafts Board. So beaded cradle band, necklace, bow and rawhide string, arrows, bracelet, cradle doll, 2 types of moccasins. I have been on many, many emails and phone calls with the Department of the Interior Museum and the Indian Arts and Crafts Board Museum, and they have no records of where these objects are now. But the Indian Arts and Crafts Board actually was the main institution of which objects, pieces, art was borrowed for, so where the World's Fair comes in, the San Francisco Golden Gate Exposition of 1939-1940 had an Indian court, and the Indian Arts and Crafts Board was instrumental. I've been trying to figure out, I've gone through lots of different books and catalogs and images, but it is possible that this beadwork was displayed there, but again, removed of its context. So, and there's and this is the, and that was René de Harncourt too, who later did the MoMA exhibition. And here's more information. I won't go through all this because we're running out of time. Other WP administrators said, you know, we want some of these pieces for an exhibition in Washington, DC. The only information I can find about that exhibition is this poster. So, you know, it's possible that you know, that Prairie Band Potawatomi beadwork created by this WPA program was exhibited all over the country. But, you know, that information is lost. So I think, you know, there's some concluding issues, but the one thing I wanted to show, I wanted to show all of the pieces that we know exist now. So, I don't know if you guys can. Almost all of the pieces from this program that we know exist are at the Spencer Museum of Art right now. And they came to the Spencer through the Topeka Public Schools, that then in the 60s, 70s went to the Miniger Foundation Museum, that then went to the, I think it would have been the Museum of Anthropology at KU, and then the Museum of Art, and then in the future maybe elsewhere.
So yeah, it's nice of Spencer to, hang on to give us a little storage space for a little bit, but we'll be seeing you here. And I guess while we're looking, if there's any questions, or that's your job, sir. That's your job as the moderator to probe for questions.
That photo of the kids with the boy with the bandolier bag, which we think may be the bandolier bag that's in the exhibition. They look very similar. I'm like 80% sure in my research that the Topeka Public Schools acquired a lot of objects through the WPA Museum project, and they had this visual education center, which I'm like 90% sure that photo is of, and schools could borrow objects, right? When that center closed down, a number of the objects that were Native American related, the Miniger Foundation Museum acquired. Carl Miniger actually had a very significant collection of indigenous and non-European art, and which that's a whole other conversation. And they had a museum, and when that museum closed down, they sort of sent their collections to various places, and KU received a portion of those. And they were at the Anthropology Museum for a while, and then I think there was a point at which it was like, this isn't an appropriate place, right? So then they went to the Art Museum, which they are now. I will say, oh, there's the cradle board. There is one other place, and I think this lends itself to the conversation of what's appropriate for how this art should be displayed, where should it be, who should have it. There's the ledgers from the Miniger Foundation. There's one other place that I found some of this beadwork, and that's the Crawford County Museum in Pittsburgh, Kansas. And no criticism of a small county museum, but this is how it's displayed. And I know they're very interested in doing something more appropriate, and it's sort of draped over tree branches, and there's other objects that are also labeled Native American that a professor at, it wasn't Pitt State at the time, it was the Kansas Teachers College or whatever. In the 20s, there was a professor who would go down to the Southwest and get, Pueblo pottery and different objects, and they're in a case with this beadwork. So again, it's this kind of homogenizing of everything, which we need to fix. So.
All right. Well, as we transition to Q&A, we should give them a round of applause. All right. So, as we think, so just to kind of contextualize some of the threads that are coming out of this conversation and how this happened in several different communities. When you talk about art and creating these objects and that are taken out of context, there's this kind of gradient of sometimes you're getting into things that have spiritual significance, and sometimes sometimes like, you can just picture a kid or somebody doing something 100 years ago, like, I think this looks cool. Like, look, check this out. Like, just picture, like, sometimes we try to, I think we overcomplicate some of the things we're looking at, where sometimes I think people are just like, man, 1880s version, like, man, check that out. That looks good, man. Hey. But, so as a short story that I have is there's a documented, for my family, I will just say when you get in a certain context, there's certain things that aren't supposed to be talked about. And there's a documented case of my family, one of those collectors going around the community buying up stuff, and some of the things they're buying are not that big of a deal, and some of the things are. And so I came across that account, and I had never known about that, and I was just reading it on a PDF from somebody in around 1911, 12, 13, 14. They ended up in New York. And it's also one of those things where I'm sitting around going through the museum in New York, and all of a sudden I come across something that my first reaction is, I don't even know if I'm supposed to be looking at this right now. And so those types of things happen. It's kind of hard to understand or process because of what's also with that is generations and generations of cultural genocide through education and weaponization of education. So we also don't have all the information we need to understand how to process it. And so those are some more of those entanglements that occur. And so some of what I'm hearing, I have parallel stories that I can interject. And when we're talking about the applique, ribbon work is one of the, clearly the Osage are the best at all ribbon work. And so, no, but there are unique styles where when you go to these ceremonies and you go to powwows or you go to certain things, you're like, looks very Osage, or that looks very tribe X, tribe Y. And so you can see some of those things, even though there's a shared kind of technique. But with that being said, I just want to contextualize that it happens in lots of different communities, and there are these shared stories. And so let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
I'm really struck by these objects that are essentially stolen, being in museums. What work is being done to repatriate them? And does it seems to me it would probably fall on the nations to do all that work to reclaim their stolen objects. So I'm just curious, has there been any success with that, getting these things back that are yours?
How about that for a nice loaded question with museum people in the same room
Right.
as tribal reps?
Where's all the exits at real quick here? No, so from the experience that I've had, it's generally, I want to say those conversations are moving in a positive direction. Obviously, as was mentioned and is known, we have items all over the place. And for some of us, we can look at the design in the beadwork, if you will, and kind of have an understanding of what family it comes from, or which maybe area or those types of things. And for Potawatomi specifically, one of the reasons, again, to highlight the Confederacy is that we, the TIPO and NAGPRA, between all of our bands, we've really started working together a lot in the last couple of years to help each other out. And just last week, Pokagon band reached out to our office and said, hey, there's this gentleman in Illinois. We know you guys had villages in the area of what he's describing to us. He has some objects and items, and so they called us and asked if we had the capacity to work with that, because they offered, if we couldn't make it, then they offered to go out and have that conversation with that individual. And so those are examples of, at least for us, some of the things that we're doing today to kind of help with that work. I've recently been appointed to the advisory board for the Field Museum, and as we all know, that's one of the big players in that. So yeah, those conversations are happening at the very high levels. Unfortunately, especially those big institutions, just like anywhere else, there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of bureaucracy that you have to kind of work through to get there. And then on the flip side, on Monday I'll be speaking to the Illinois Board of Museums for the small to mid-sized museums, where maybe those professionals have very limited exposure, if any at all, to NAGPRA, or what that means and what that means for their museums and institutions. And so again, there's a whole education process that's taking place in those settings.
Just want to double check. Does everybody in the room know what NAGPRA is? Native American Graves and Repatriation Act? Is that right? Native American, yeah. Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, also from the 90s, right? So in that wave. And basically, so there's the art version of this conversation we're having, but art can also turn into funerary objects and burial objects. And so when you follow that gradient and human remains, for a while it was okay to dig up non-white human remains and put them in museums. I also get a little bit weirded out when we're looking at like mummies from Egypt. Like, why can't I just leave them alone? All right, but that's what NAGPRA. So these museums in Kansas, all of a sudden are like looking around and like, oh crap, we got a bunch of ancestors in our building and their objects. And so Native American Graves and Repatriation Act is those tribal nations have a right to have a say in what's going on with those ancestors and those objects, because they were taken quite often, or they were dug up. The whole city of St. Louis used to have mounds, and those mounds are no longer there. Well, most of them. But so that's the little backdrop for anybody that if you hear NAGPRA and you're like, wait, what are we talking about? But what I want to highlight is how many historic preservation officers do you have? Is it you two, basically? Okay, you got these two. Did you see that migratory map that they put up earlier? Okay, so every single museum or every single institute that starts to come across objects, think about the capacity of these two hopping on planes, getting on phone calls, and he's on our Kansas Education Advisory Council, and he's got council meetings, and so like the capacity to do those things is also in the backdrop of this. So if you've ever reached out to Indian country and they didn't respond immediately, just keep that in mind, all right? So, but this isn't my show. I just wanted to make sure we had that context. Go ahead.
Make a comment too. Liz, sorry.
This is related to what you were talking about. I understand you also visited the Discovery Center and also saw some material in the Raleigh County Historical Society collection. Could you say a bit about that?
I mean, they got our moccasins over there, and you know, they got some items that probably belong to Osage also, and I mean, but again, that's where the conversations have to happen, right? We can't go back and stop the guys from stealing whatever, you know, or selling, or, you know, whatever happened, right? But, you know, we know better now, so we can do better and try to do the right thing and have these conversations. And the willingness to have the conversation is the first step, right? You know, there's a high school here in town. We need to have a willingness to have the conversation as the first step on some of those things, because again, that ties back into the dehumanization of our people. And see, when that conversation comes up, it often gets lost in race, but that's one of the things that we have to remember, is we are not another race in this country that occupies this space. We have a separate political status with the United States government. Our political status with the United States government is the mechanism that allowed the United States government to be able to come in and occupy these additional areas. And so, again, sorry, I'm getting way out in left field here. But yeah, just to have those conversations, and like Alex highlighted, I mean, there's Tara and myself in our office, you know, and generally that's the way it is for most other tribal nations, is there's one or two. There's a few that have maybe four, but again, everywhere that we've been removed from, and then that's not to mention all of our burial mounds or other, you know, village sites that were dug up or raided, and then everything dispersed. We're working on a repatriation right now with Indiana University, because they've got the ancestors, but Gilcrease down in Tulsa have the funerary objects, and they were all originated from Illinois. And so again, that's just one example of how vast all of this work is.
I wanted to say something about the Flint Hills Discovery Center. So the Pawnee Nation, a representative, was there, and since we are, you know, new to this territory, we went ahead and let them take the lead on that one, because of, you know, Wichita, Osage, Kaw, this is their homelands. You know, this is their ancestral lands, and so we know that as, you know, Prairie Band, Potawatomi being here, and so we make space for the tribes who are here first to have first say on anything that goes on in this territory. And that's something I'm learning, and that's what I'm seeing when I'm doing these consultations, is I'm willing to step back and say, hey, you take the lead on this one. I respect this is your land. And, you know, we expect that, you know, that happens to us too. If it's Illinois, they defer to us because Potawatomi, that's our territory, especially in the Chicago area. That is, Prairie Band, Potawatomi land. So that's one thing I noticed is really cool to see tribes work together and come together, and we all want the same thing. We want the items back where they belong, and we want our ancestors back in the ground where they can rest easy and not be disturbed anymore.
As you reclaim or reacquire these objects that are yours, if by some miraculous happenstance you were able to, like all of these beautiful items that we've seen, I guess, I don't know, what are plans? How would you curate them, care for them? What would you do? Or bluntly, is that none of my business?
So for us, due to lack of physical space, generally what we enter into is ownership agreements, where we retain our ownership in those items, and then the care is whatever we'll use KU for an example, right? So KU has some of our things, but we don't have the capacity to house them at this time. So KU will still have them on their property and their storage, but we own those items. And then when it comes to the point where we're able to, if it comes to that point, well, when it comes to that point, we're working on it. Then yeah, we'll have that next step in that process of bringing those things home. And then for us though, it depends too, because some of these things were never in Kansas, right? So it doesn't make sense to bring certain things to Kansas. But again, it's just, there's so much to it, right? There's just so many factors that come into play. I wish I could say it's as easy as, well, some of this stuff, it is pretty easy. Yeah, this stuff was created from our community in the 30s. And my thing is, I think the agreements that were signed by those individuals was for compensation of their time, not compensation of whatever they produced. And so, again, there's just different factors play into all that.
So, for example, for the bandolier bag that's on display, I was really thankful that you guys reached out and asked us to, look at the label. Well, how do we want to label this? Because it was our chance to, take, Indian item out and put, what it is, exactly what it was used for, and the history of it, and the significance that these items have to our tribe. And I really love doing that because it's almost, I'm a beadwork artist, and so I look at these designs and I take all my, I look at them and I'm like, I can incorporate some of this into my beadwork, and like at the end it's my own because I use my own colors, I use my own style. And you'll see that some comparisons to some of this work to my beadwork on the table, it is directly from my ancestors' work. And they pulled it from their ancestors. And you'll notice Potawatomi style beadwork is it has changed over the years, but I did talk to an elder beadwork artist, and she said that the white outline is what she noticed the older beadwork look like. And so that's kind of one way we identify it. We're not the only ones who do white outline, but this that kind of helps us kind of get us in the ballpark of what maybe tribes these items can belong to. And it's simple things like that, colors, designs, styles. Like I didn't even realize how many geometric designs we had till I saw these bandolier bags. I was like, wow, I was just thought we were florals, and we have these, really cool designs. And I'm sure they mean something. I'm not sure exactly what they mean. And another thing I want to say is when we're beading, we need to be in a very good state of mind. Like spiritually, we need to be there. And a lot of times when we bead, we pray for the person that we're beading for. And so those, these, even though they were, given out, I'm sure there was good thoughts into what they were doing, because if you have bad thoughts, you will probably poke yourself, or you will misplace the bead, or you will get a knot, because I've done it. And I'm like, I gotta take a break. I got some bad thoughts. And then I'll go for a walk, and I'll come back, and then it's perfect. Or your lines won't be straight. So when we do work, it's like it's pretty sacred. It's like a time to reflect, and all the thoughts are gonna go to that person wearing that item. And so when I bead for people, I want them to know that I pray for them, I pray for their families, all those good thoughts are going into my work.
I was about to say, what was your state of mind when you beat that lanyard over there? No, it's-
That
do I need to
Potawatomis,
leave it here or
that
what?
Potawatomis are the best.
Oh, good stuff. You want to?
Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
Someone else- I'll have the second to last word. I don't want the last word. But I just wanted to say that just this whole conversation about like the resources that, the fact that, there's you two, two TIPOs and that a lot of tribes, maybe four at the most, and all of this work that you have to do, like for those of us who are not native in this world, like this is incumbent on us. Right? We need to be doing this work, right? We shouldn't be saying, hey, do all this work for us. What's this stuff? And okay, we'll give it back to, like this is our work. And, we shouldn't, I think it's important to forge these connections, but we should go into these connections doing as much work as we can ahead of time and learning on our own, and also coming in with sort of I think, as you said, things seem to be getting better in terms of recognition of who owns this and where should it be. But, even working on this project, some people ask, well, but they were paid wages, and is it really, property of Prairie Band Potawatomi? I'm like, that's not the right perspective, right? We shouldn't be going into it with this perspective. So I think we're seeing that shift among non-natives in the museum world. Maybe we're getting less terrible, right? But for me, that the most satisfying part of this project is being able to reconnect you with this. And I hope one day there is a space where you can have this beadwork where you want it. So, and I think that should be the goal in mind for all of us. So that's all I have to say.
So she just did another acronym drop there, TIPO, all right? If you hear TIPO and you hear SHPO, basically Tribal Historic Preservation Officers and State Historic Preservation Officers. And so what that signals, though, is when we talk about sovereignty, and we go back to Rafe's conversation about political class, that those are governments, or tribal governments have Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, state governments have State Historic Preservation Officers. So when the Kansas State Historical Society comes across certain things, there needs to be, so it really we could talk about art, but it really rapidly comes into a government-to-government conversation. And so it's all about tribal consultations, government-to-government relationships, government-to-government, intergovernmental agreements, interinstitutional agreements, and this is how tribes have to operate. And so one of the statistics I toss out all the time is 93% of American Indian kids are in state-run public schools, which means that tribal governments do not have a say in what's going on in the schools where their kids are going. And so there's a need for state governments and school districts to build partnerships with tribes and be in collaboration with one another. So that same conversation happens in museums and art, and it also happens in building roads. It also happens in tribal enterprise. So those things are all surrounding, and that's why conversations like this actually open the door to learn about tribal sovereignty and government-to-government relationships, even though we're talking about 1930s WPA art. And so I'll stop doing my social studies teacher thing. Go ahead.
So yeah, thank you, Alex. And then one other thing that I want to mention is, the shift in focus to what Tara mentioned earlier and what was mentioned earlier as only viewing us in historical context. Some of the conversations that we've had also is, does your museum or your art institute have an interest in commissioning a contemporary artist? We've got perfect examples of, some visual art here, and so, that's also an option. I think Tara and a few others are early in the process of commissioning some work for Detroit Institute of Art, right? And so then that way, in 100 and some years, our great-great-grandkids can have those same conversations, like, well, what were they doing? Did they know what they were signing? Did they know you guys were going to try to hold it forever? But yeah, so and again, there's ways to formulate these partnerships and move forward together. And I just wanted to, make that statement also, so it's not just all doom and gloom and all that kind of stuff. But partnerships like this is a really good opportunity to open the door for those. So thank you.
Maybe one or two more questions.
I was just astounded by the travels of the Potawatomi Nation through all those states. Can you explain why you move so much?
So, okay, 3 minute version. So in our histories, we have stories of interacting with the Vikings. Okay, and this was way before any Columbus or any of that took place, right? Now, the way I understand it is there were several factors going on over by the East Coast when we came to the Great Lakes area. One of which was we started seeing people who didn't look like the folks we were accustomed to and familiar with, and they acted different. They behaved differently. And so, again, without being able to divulge a lot here, some of our teachings are that it was time for us to do what we did, which was to relocate to the Great Lakes. And so that was, that kind of initial migration, that primary migration. And interestingly enough, when we did that, though, our people kind of encircled the lakes at that time. And, there's Three Fires Confederacy, Ojibwe, Odawa, Potawatomi, and all the roles that we had and the relationships that we had with one another. Sorry, this is longer than 3 minutes, but yeah. So there was reasons, there was teachings that were given to us, to our people, and signs that we were to be aware of, and that worked out fine until we decided to burn down Fort Dearborn, and then yeah, they didn't want us in Chicago anymore.
So I think we're about ready to close out. Any burning questions? All right, so I'll just conclude by saying first, thank you. Thank you for bringing your insight today. Let's give them a round of applause. And just to kind of close the loop and close out, I think thinking about, and gifts for you as well. And so as she's offering gifts, so I want to kind of circle back to that big old portrait of Uncle Moog down there. And the reason I want to circle back to it is because one of the things I didn't fully explain was he's been instrumental in Osage language revitalization, in the creation of an Osage alphabet, because we were depending on English phonetics to spell things, and they didn't really match the sounds. And so you would get these different spellings of the same words. And we brought up the placard. So the actual placard explaining the portrait has that language on there. But what that is that's also another form of artistry. And so when we talk about forced removal, and a little bit of a resistance, like burning down forts and pushing back a little bit, through all that, I was like, was it Gerald Weisner's Survivance? And this idea that we're constantly pushing to survive and persevere, but we haven't just been rolling over and doing nothing. And so these conversations about art, creativity, and expression are continuing into the present, and where that portrait of Uncle Moog was so important for me to try to make highly visible because of what he represents, that idea of moving forward, adapting. And so if you look at that map of the Potawatomis, there's this constant evolution, adaptation, evolution, adaptation. American Indians aren't static people. And so art is one of the platforms that evolution unfolds. And so if you get a chance to go visit Uncle Moog's portrait, just know that as an elder person, that dude created an alphabet and then coordinated people, and he got enough support to get that thing into Unicode. and now we can text it, and now we can post it on Twitter, and now we can share on Facebook and even use Google Docs. And so that's the type of stuff that comes from that creativity that was born and protected. So like the fact that even though we don't always have all the information because of the fragmented, destructive education our ancestors went through, the pieces that we do have allow us to continue to kind of move us into the future, move those ways into the future, and let them evolve, because that's what we do, is evolve as people. And so I will close with that and say, Wemina, thank you. Thank you to our panelists, and one final round of applause.